This is part 2 of our 2-part cloud study. In the last study, we learned some basic wet-on-wet techniques and using one color to complete each of the 4 mini paintings. In this 4 mini paintings, we will be going a little bit more complex than the last. And if you're working from the reference photos I provided, don't get too caught up in the details trying to paint each cloud perfectly. So we begin with this pink and blue sunset with these wispy clouds. I pre-mix my colors for this study, and it's advised so that you work more quickly. I pre-mix the blue sky color, mixing cerulean blue and a touch of phthalo blue. I also mix an orange, a pink, and a cool purple, which I achieved by adding a bit of phthalo blue to the purple. You're going to want to pre-wet the paper, so using clean water, brushing up and down and sideways, and get it fairly saturated but not pooling with water. I start with the orange color first, painting in wispy shapes where I think the orange should go based on the reference photo that I'm using. And then I also, in between those orange bits, I drop in some of the rosy pink, filling in the space. While the paper is still wet, I go in with the blue and I paint that blue right up beside the orange. I actually go in twice with the blue to get the correct intensity. And if you look at the reference photo, you notice there's quite a bit of purple right at the bottom of the reference photo. I go in with the pre-mixed purple and I put a little layer of that on the bottom while it's still wet. I actually let this layer dry and move on to the next painting, and I come back to this later to finish it off. Next up is this dramatic cumulonimbus cloud. We'll be using the wet on dry technique for this, and if you like, you can lightly draw in the shape of this cloud. It will kind of help you guide you better as you begin painting. Again, I mix up my blue using cerulean and a touch of phthalo blue. And I just begin painting the sky right onto the dry paper. No need to pre-wet. It's kind of like painting in a coloring page. This is what we call a wet on dry technique, since we did not pre-wet the paper first. And for the cloud itself, I use the same pigment I did for the sky, but I simply add a bit more water to it to make it a lighter value. Then I go ahead and paint in the cloud shadows. You want to paint the general shapes that you see and keeping some white near the tops of the clouds. What I did is I actually squinted at the reference photo to check the accuracy of my values. And like I said before, try not to get too caught up in the details. I try to keep it quite loose and expressive as I paint. And you'll probably notice, because the area isn't wet, that you're going to have a bunch of hard edges. You're going to want to balance that out by softening some of the edges. So you're going to clean your brush, dab off the excess water on a paper towel, and then using the brush, run along the edges and blend them out. And you don't want to blend all of them. Keep a few hard edges here and there. And you want a bit of a balance. At the base of the cloud, it's going to be a little bit darker, so drop in a slightly darker blue, which means less water, and darken those bottom clouds up. If you need to lift up some of your pigment to fix an area, just blot it up with some paper towel while it's still wet. One final time while the paper is still wet, go ahead and drop some more of that darker pigment at the base of the clouds to boost up the saturation. It's at this point that I come back to my first mini painting to finish this guy off. Decided that the top section needed some more blue, and I painted a strip of blue at the top, washed off my brush, wiped the excess water, and blended that hard edge, bringing down some of that pigment. Using the purple, I begin creating some of those dark cloud shapes. The top edges are bleeding into the blue above, which is fine because the blue section is still wet, which is creating a lovely soft edge there. At the bottom of the purple clouds, I actually go in with some of the pink and add that to the bottom sections of each of the clouds, and moving along the sky, placing all the purple clouds. Then I go in with a slightly darker purple, so less watered down, to darken up the shadows of the clouds. And I also want to blend some of those hard edges. Go ahead and dry this layer completely. And I wanted to experiment with a glazing technique Basically what that means is I've watered down some of the pink and orange, and I'm going to layer that pigment right on top of the sky and the cloud area. I also go in at the top and add another layer of blue, and I want to blend those two edges together. So the section where I did the wash of orange and pink, and then just blend that in with a clean damp brush with the blue. This painting actually turned out way more subtle and softer compared to the reference photo. Like, I couldn't get the vibrancy, but I was pretty happy with how it turned out. Up next is this orange sunset with dark storm clouds. And I'm gonna warn you, I struggled with this one. I have not previously painted many clouds in my art career, but struggling sometimes is part of the learning process, and I had to try this one a couple times. And you may have to try these studies a few times as well, just experimenting and practicing. And remember, practice makes improvement. As always, I am pre-mixing some of my colors because these little studies tend to have to work a little quicker. Now, this is a simple gradient technique. Orange is actually on the bottom in a gradient, and it just gets lighter and lighter until it reaches the top. And so I add that dark orange at the bottom in a thick strip, clean my brush off and dab off the extra water so it's just like a damp brush, and then I run the brush along the edge of that orange color, pulling the pigment to the top of the paper and just going back and forth and working that until I get kind of a smooth gradation. Alright, so you're gonna dry this layer completely. As you can see, I'm using a hair dryer for most of these because I'm too impatient, and I go ahead and I mix up a purple gray, and I mix this with, I have a burgundy color, and I add some blue into that with a touch of Payne's Gray. Now, this next layer, I really struggled. You can see I attempted to apply the dark clouds, wasn't happy with it. So I decided to wet the entire area, and I took a paper towel and I blotted the pigment up. And I was able to take enough off that I could try a second time. And I dried the paper completely and then went over it again with the orange and kind of boosted up the saturation again, because I took a lot off when I blotted up with a paper towel. And I dry it with a hairdryer again, make sure it's completely bone dry. I decided, so the second round, I wasn't going to mix the orange highlight color and the purple at the same time. I think that was where I went wrong. It just wasn't, I don't know, I wasn't liking the look of it. So instead, I put down the purple, the dark purple clouds, and laid out the shapes, and after the paint mostly dried, then I went in with the orange at the bottom of the underside of the cloud, and I basically made that orange highlight, and then I brought that orange color right on top of the dark purple. And once I applied that orange, I went in and washed my brush and got the excess water off with a paper towel, and I blended the bottom edges of those clouds with my brush. So I left a lot of the top sections of the clouds with that hard purple edge. I wanted the underside, which was orange, to be a bit softer. But at the end, I actually went in with some of the dark purple. I watered it down a little bit, and I added some little wispy cloud details surrounding some of the main clouds. I painted the foreground first. I started with the blue hillside, and I mixed up a dark blue using phthalo blue and a touch of Payne's Gray, and I painted that directly onto the dry paper. And this is called dry brushing, and I didn't have a lot of pigment loaded in my paintbrush, and so when that happens, you'll brush out an area, and sometimes it will actually leave little specks of white. And so I wanted to leave a little bit of white when I painted the foreground, just to give it kind of almost like a little sparkle. I did the same thing with the the grass section in the foreground. My favorite color is this green by Daniel Smith. It's called Gold Green, and that's what I use for the base. It's a really yellow green. So I laid this down for the first layer of the grass in the foreground, and then I added another layer while it was still wet, a dark sap green, just to darken up the grass kind of around the perimeter. I kind of left the middle section. Go ahead and dry that layer completely. I then add the Payne's Gray to the sap green color to make it a shade darker, and I use this to darken the edges of the grass a little further. And I mix a touch more Payne's Gray into the blue color that I use for the hillside, and I want to darken the edges for the hill as well, and I use that color to add in a few little tree details just to make it a little more interesting. And that finished off this little mini painting. I don't know if I'm completely happy with how the clouds turned out. I think I would definitely try it again, but I for sure learned a lot. Up next is the stormy skies, and this is also a little bit more complex, but was actually a lot easier than the last one. I don't know why. I did start out with a pencil sketch because this one was a bit more detailed, and so I was able to kind of already see where I wanted to put the clouds. And I begin by painting a simple gradient of this bluish gray. I used my leftover mix of the Phthalo Blue and Payne's Gray that I used in the previous painting. And I paint my strip at the top because that's going to be the darkest. And I go ahead and clean my brush by wiping off the excess water onto a paper towel. And then I use my damp brush to blend out the bottom of the sky. And you want to keep the sky, as it gets closer to that horizon line, you want it quite light. And I use the same mixture to paint the ocean, making sure I'm leaving little bits of white peeking through. I add some more Payne's Gray to darken up that color, and if you don't have Payne's Gray, you can use a black as well. They're pretty similar because I want to darken up the ocean again, and I decide that I didn't leave enough white sparkle on the ocean, so I go ahead and lift up some of that pigment with a paper towel in like thin strips. And for the clouds, I mix up two kinds of gray, a cool blue gray and a warm purple burgundy gray. To mix up the cool gray, I use predominantly Payne's Gray with a little bit of blue. And for the warm gray, I use the Payne's Gray as the base and then add a tiny bit of red and blue. And you want a bit more red than blue because the red is going to make it warmer. I didn't pre-wet the sky. I just painted the clouds directly onto the dry paper. I was pretty loose with how I put down the paint for the clouds, but I did blend the bottom clouds close to the horizon because the clouds closest to the horizon are going to be the lightest. And I use the paper towel to blot up some of the paint near the horizon just to make sure I'm keeping it quite light. Now, with this first layer, I'm just trying to get down the general shape of these clouds, making sure I'm keeping some of the light sky showing through. I don't want to cover this entire thing with the dark watercolor. And try to keep it loose and don't get too caught up in the details. I also applied some salt to this layer to see if I can bring out some cool texture in the first layer. And I know what you're thinking. Tara, this is a lot of layers. Yeah, it is. I didn't even realize until I'd come to edit and I was like, all right, well, this is a lot. So my motto is keep going until it looks good, which often just means adding layer on layer and just getting it at a contrast that I'm satisfied with. Because honestly, watercolor is all about layering and darkening as you go. I also applied that cool gray mixture to the ocean to darken that up as well. And while the paint is still wet, I actually use the paper towel to bring up some of the paint. The little areas where the sunlight will be poking through the dark clouds. I just wanted to make sure I was preserving those light areas. So I went in and lifted a little bit more pigment and let this layer dry. Using the cool gray, I blocked in the next layer of clouds. Now on this layer, I don't want all hard edges. So using a clean damp brush, blend out some of those edges, keep some of them still hard. I ran out of my cool gray mixture, so I mixed up a fresh batch. This time a touch darker because we're layering the dark watercolor on top of each other, and we want to get darker until we hit that desired contrast. So while the previous layer is still wet, I lay down that darker mixture where you see the darkest clouds, and you're really wanting to apply this sparingly at the end, remembering that those lighter clouds are near the horizon and you don't want those to be too dark. So don't bring the darkest clouds too far down. If you are going to add more clouds near the horizon at this point, you want to water down the mixture so it's not too dark. I am calling it done. I was pretty happy with how dramatic this one turned out. And if you have any questions about any of these mini paintings, if you need a bit more clarification, let me know. I am here to help, and I'll see you in the next one.